History deserves to be remembered. And today, we're going to tell you about the most feared pilots of World War II. But these weren't experienced fighter aces flying cutting-edge aircraft. These were young women, some barely out of their teens, flying obsolete biplanes made of plywood and canvas. The Germans called them Nachthexen, night witches, and they had good reason to fear them. This is the story of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, an all-female Soviet air unit that flew over 23,000 combat missions and dropped more than 3,000 tons of bombs on Nazi forces. And they did it in planes so primitive, they were supposed to be used for crop dusting. June 1941, Nazi Germany launches Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Within months, German forces are racing toward Moscow. The Soviet military is desperate. They need every pilot, every plane, every advantage they can get. Enter Irina Sebrova. She's already a legend, a record-breaking aviator, the Soviet Amelia Earhart. Before the war, she was the first woman to become a navigator in the Soviet Air Force. When the invasion begins, she receives thousands of letters from women across the Soviet Union, all saying the same thing: "Let us fight. Let us fly. Let us defend our homeland." Stalin himself gives Sebrova permission to form 3 all-female air regiments. Not mixed units with some women. Entirely female. Pilots, navigators, mechanics, commanders, everything. Most military leaders are skeptical. Women flying combat missions in the most brutal war in history? It'll never work, they say. They were about to be proven very, very wrong. But there's a problem. The Soviet Air Force is stretched thin. The best planes, the Yak fighters, the Il-2 Sturmovix, are already assigned to experienced male pilots. So what do the women get? The Polikarpov Po-2, a biplane, designed in 1928, made of plywood covered with canvas. Open cockpit, no radio, no guns, no parachutes. There wasn't room. Maximum speed, 94 miles per hour. The Germans flew Messerschmitt Bf-19s that could go over 350 miles per hour. The Po-2 was a training aircraft, a crop duster. It was never meant for combat. But the women of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment would turn it into one of the most effective weapons of the war. How? By turning its weaknesses into strengths. The Po-2 was slow. Too slow. It flew so slowly that German fighter planes couldn't engage it properly. If they slowed down to match its speed, they would stall and crash. The Po-2's stall speed was actually lower than the Messerschmitt's minimum speed. The Po-2 was made of wood and fabric. That meant it didn't show up well on radar. It was nearly invisible. The Po-2 had no weapons, so they couldn't fight back. But that meant they were light. They could carry bombs, and they could fly low. Very, very low. Here's what the night witches would do. They would wait until night. Then they would fly in groups of 3. When they approached the target, a German encampment, supply depot, or artillery position, the first 2 planes would attract attention, drawing searchlights and anti-aircraft fire. Then, the 3rd pilot would do something insane. She would cut her engine. In total silence, gliding like a ghost, she would descend over the target. The only sound the Germans would hear was the wind whistling through the wooden struts of the biplane. It sounded like a witch's broomstick. Then, bombs away. The engine would roar back to life, and she'd escape into the darkness while the Germans were still scrambling. They would do this 8, 10, sometimes 15 times a night, every single night, in all weather, in temperatures that dropped to 40 degrees. Let me tell you about some of these women. Nadezhda Popova. She flew 852 missions. Her plane was hit by enemy fire multiple times. Once, She counted 42 bullet holes in her aircraft after a single mission. She kept flying. Irina Sebrova. She holds the record, 1,008 combat missions. More than 1,000 times, she flew into enemy territory, dropped her bombs, and flew back. She survived the entire war. Yevgenia Zhigulenko. Shot down multiple times. Survived. Kept flying. After the war, she became a filmmaker and directed a movie about the night witches. But not all of them made it home. The 588th Regiment lost 32 pilots killed in action. 32 young women who never saw their families again. The youngest pilot was just 17 years old when she started flying combat missions. The Germans were terrified of them. Soldiers on the front lines would panic when they heard that distinctive sound, the wind through the struts, like a broom sweeping through the sky. The Luftwaffe command offered an immediate Iron Cross, Germany's highest military honor, to any pilot who shot down a night witch. That's the same medal they awarded for shooting down a heavily armed bomber or a squadron of fighters. Think about that. The Germans considered shooting down one woman in a plywood biplane to be as valuable as destroying a B-17 flying fortress. German soldiers wrote in their diaries about the night witches. They described how demoralizing it was, how they couldn't sleep, how every night, without fail, the women would return. You could shoot one down, and 2 more would take her place. One German officer wrote, "We simply couldn't believe that the Soviet pilots that made up the night bombers were in fact women. These women feared nothing." By the end of the war, 23 of the night witches had been awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest honor in the country. The regiment had flown 23,772 missions. They had dropped 3,000 tons of bombs and 26,000 incendiary shells. But after the war, their story was largely forgotten in the West. The Cold War began, and stories of Soviet heroism didn't fit the narrative. In Russia, they were celebrated, but the rest of the world knew nothing about them. It wasn't until the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, that historians began to fully document what these women had accomplished. Nadezhda Popova, the pilot who flew 852 missions, lived until 2013. She was 91 years old. In her later years, she was asked what she wanted people to know about the night witches. She said, "We were young. We were terrified. But we had a job to do. Our country was being destroyed. Our people were dying. So we flew." She also said this, "At night sometimes you'd fly through clouds and see the reflection of explosions below. You'd see the fires. You'd know people were dying down there. And you'd know that in a few minutes, you'd be flying over that same target, and they'd be shooting at you. But you couldn't think about that. You had to think about your navigator, your mission, getting home. You had to trust your training and your aircraft, even if it was just plywood and prayers." The last surviving night witch, Galina Brok-Beltsova, passed away in 2019 at the age of 99. With her death, an era ended. There are no more living night witches, but their legacy remains. Today, in Russia, there are monuments to the 588th Regiment. Schools are named after them. Their story is taught to children. And around the world, historians, filmmakers, and writers are finally telling their story. Because these women, these young, brave, incredible women, deserve to be remembered. They flew in planes made of wood and fabric. They had no weapons, no radios, no parachutes. They faced some of the most elite pilots in the German Luftwaffe. They flew in conditions that would ground modern aircraft, and they never stopped. Night after night after night, for 4 years, they terrorized the most powerful military machine in history. The Night Witches, 23 heroes of the Soviet Union, over 23,000 combat missions, and a legacy that reminds us that courage has no gender. History deserves to be remembered. This story is based entirely on historical facts. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment was real, the women mentioned were real, and their accomplishments are documented in military archives. This is one of the most incredible true stories from World War II.